Okay, I think that's everybody in now. Good morning and a very warm welcome to you all to What to Do This Week, number 16. We are supported today by the wonderful Charlie Waller Memorial Trust, which is an organisation supporting employers and line managers to tackle the stigmas of ill mental health in the workplace and help to make that a more healthy environment. Today we are looking at redundancy. There obviously have been large-scale redundancies as a sad feature of the post-COVID response. We actually have a conference next Thursday afternoon which will examine some of the more legal and technical issues in detail. But today we want to highlight some of the issues around the process and look at this challenge for employers in a global context. I am delighted to be joined by a great lineup today. Tom Hadley will be talking about the way in which employers around the world are approaching this workforce challenge. Richard Eichen will be looking at how you should be working with your unions and thinking how to make the process less traumatic, while Penny Aspinall from the Charlie Waller Trust will be highlighting ways in which to support your line managers and staff who are directly involved in these rather challenging processes. Tom, if I could trouble you now to put your mic and camera on, that would be fantastic.
Yes.
Tom, who runs the fabulously named Hadley's Comment, and he will be sharing some of his expertise in the area of global workforce trends and predictions. Tom is a consultant and business coach, and he specialises in advocacy, reputation management, and global workforce issues. And over the course of his long career, has been a representative on over a dozen government forums and served on the board of the World Employment Confederation. Tom, thank you very much.
Good. Good morning, everybody. I'll share my screen now. So these are the slides that I'll be talking us through. So hopefully you can see that. So yeah, good morning, everybody. So until quite recently, I was the Director of Campaigns and Policy at the Recruitment and Employment Confederation, which is the main body for employment and recruitment experts in the UK. So I recently launched out on my own, doing some freelance work and project work, but a lot of that is very relevant to today's theme. So delighted to be with you and share some of the insight. My contact details are below. If there's any questions on the presentation, do drop me an email or contact me via Twitter afterwards. Just in terms of some background, so the current work I'm working on is with the International Labour Organization. So it's a project, but essentially it's looking at what the new normal, what does the post-COVID landscape mean for businesses around the world. So the International Labour Organization is part of the United Nations. The Director General of the ILO, that's his quote beneath. It's all about finding that balance between business success, but also doing things in the right way around ethics, about looking after your staff. So it's a tripartite organisation which brings together national governments, and it has been quite interesting to see how different governments around the world are adapting to the crisis, but it brings together employer bodies, which is where I've been focusing, but also trade unions. So it'll be really interesting to hear a little bit more about how you work with trade unions at this difficult time. So that's the sort of background. So it's really a global insight that I'm providing today. Interestingly, a lot of the themes I'll touch on were big themes pre-crisis. So how you use AI and automation, perhaps as to supplement your workforce, that's a big theme. So that top right visual is about the sort of future of work agenda, which the ILO again has been leading. So a lot of the themes that were being discussed pre-crisis are actually accelerating at this current time. So they're not necessarily new, but they're definitely having more energy put behind them. And that bottom logo is some work I'm also doing with the World Employment Confederation. So that's the global body for employment experts. So I'm trying to pull a lot of that together to set the scene for today's agenda. But before we talk about some of the global issues and look at what that means for you guys here in the UK, perhaps let's start with a UK perspective. And I just thought I'd start with a bit of background in terms of what's happening in the jobs market. So I get asked this, quite a lot, what's really happening out there. And of course, it's a very, very difficult time. Every day, there's more stories, aren't there, about employers losing staff, employers closing, especially again today in the hospitality and catering sector. So it's a difficult time for the jobs market, but there are some signs of life. And this is a a report that came out just this week, which is why I thought I'd flag it. So very timely. This is something that my previous employer, the REC, does in conjunction with MZ. And it's called the Jobs Recovery Tracker. And it really looks at what jobs are starting to come back to the fore in terms of demand. So it's a very quick survey. It comes out 2 weeks after the research is put out in the field. And what it shows is there are some signs of life there in terms of jobs postings and where employers are actually looking for staff. And yes, it's around IT professionals, web designers. So that whole technical jobs agenda is going to continue to be massive. So if you're an employer thinking, actually, what does a post-crisis, post-lockdown landscape look like? A lot of employers are saying, actually, we're going to still need to recruit staff in some of these highly technical areas, but it also grew in other areas like LGV drivers, sales administrators, etc. So it's worth keeping an eye on some of these surveys that come out. This is on the REC website if you want to get the full listing, because when we look ahead at workforce challenges, yes, at the moment it's about looking at, we might have to be making cuts, but there are some areas where we're going to need to hire. And how are you going to do that in the current landscape? I think it's a very interesting agenda. So just to flag that data, which is again hot off the press and is also quite regionally based as well, which is quite topical in light of some of the research that came out today around mobility and people moving for jobs or not moving for jobs, which again, I think will be an interesting debate going forward. So let's go back to the global agenda now. And I'm going to flag, based on the conversations I've had really over the last month or so with employers and business organizations around the world, what are the top 7 emerging workforce challenges? And again, this will lead a good segue into some of the more specific discussions afterwards. Maybe take a moment to reflect on what your workforce challenges are. So yes, making redundancies, which is one of the themes today, is probably there. If not, you wouldn't be on the webinar. But what are the other workforce challenges that you're facing in your business? And it will be interesting to see if your list fits with my list based on, again, the feedback from business organizations around the world. So I'll go through these quite quickly. If there's any questions or feedback you've got on these, do put that in the Q&A box. We're really interested to get your feedback on this. So this is the top 7, again, based on global employers, global employer bodies, and let's see if that fits with some of your concerns. So number 1, again, this isn't in any particular order of priority, but these are the top 7 that I've picked up. Definitely managing the return to the workplaces process. I put that in brackets, but a lot of people talk to return to work. A lot of people have been working, so it's actually a return to the workplace that we're talking about. So how you manage that has been a massive test for HR, for operational staff. And I think in the main, employers have got it right, i.e. not pressing people to return if they're uneasy about it, trying to reflect people's individual circumstances, etc. Taking on board the concerns. A lot of employers I've spoken to did surveys of their staff to understand what their concerns were about returning to workplace, but that has been a big priority. So interested in any questions or feedback on that afterwards. The second one, reintegrating furloughed workers. So again, this has been not an easy thing to do in terms of the psychology of it. People feel they've been perhaps out of the workplace. How do you manage that return to work for those who've been completely out of the loop for quite a few months? Some employers are doing a whole sort of re-onboarding process. Some are making a big fuss of people coming back because there is a psychological angle to this. You feel more, why was I one of the ones that was furloughed? And perhaps others weren't. So there's definitely something how you reintegrate that and create cohesion within the workplace where you've got people who have been working and those who haven't. So that's an interesting agenda. Some good examples of good practice there. Some perhaps less good examples I picked up is some employers saying there is a slight friction. There is a slight friction. People have perhaps been on furlough and those who've been working flat out, trying to do a lot of work. How you again, you build that cohesion post-lockdown isn't easy. So there's been some challenges as well as some good opportunities. Making redundancies, again, we're hearing a lot about this in the news. I would say there's something about being clear this is an option of last resort. A lot of the employers around the world are really making that clear that you're looking at all other options. And the reason for that comes into point 4 is reputational risk. And one of the things that I'm seeing is around the world, there's a lot of scrutiny, actually. A lot of employers who've received support from government, who've received grants, who've managed to furlough workers. How are they responding when things are coming back? So that reputational risk, I think there is a lot of scrutiny on employers and how they're responding. At the same time, there's a lot of focus on employer brand. So pre-crisis, one of the big themes for employers was how do we build a great brand which attracts the kind of workers that we need. So what you want to avoid is, in this time, which is a difficult time, doing anything that's going to impact on your reputation, impact on your employer brand. And this comes then into how you do things as well as what you do. So that reputational risk, again, is a big theme around the world. The last three, again, very topical. We were just having a chat with Liz about this before the webinar. Embedding flexible working arrangements. So what we've seen is a massive social experiment in working from home. We've seen that it can work. We want to make sure it does work going forward in a sustainable way. And I think a lot of employers say, actually, we've got through this period, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to continue. So having a look at what we can do to make flexible working arrangements work better, I think is going to be a big theme going forward. There's a lot of organizations out there that provide support to employers. TimeWise is one of those sorts of organizations. And I think that will be a big theme going forward. So that sustainability of working from home. There's a whole management agenda linked to that, performance management, etc. So I think that's definitely one to watch. And then the last couple, reviewing new skill needs. So a lot of employers I'm speaking to are coming back and saying, well, actually the world's changed. What our clients expect has changed. What our consumers and people who buy our products, what they expect has changed. So how do I perhaps reconfigure some of my business models, and what skills am I going to need to bring in? So a lot of employers are thinking, I might actually need to hire or maybe reskill. So that's a very interesting agenda on a global level. And the final one that I did want to mention is absolutely massive. So when the crisis first hit, when I was still at the REC, we were speaking to a lot of government departments, and they're saying one of the challenges is in this changed jobs market, are employers going to go away in some ways from the diversity and inclusion agenda? Why? Because one of the reasons, one of the business drivers, it was said for doing more on inclusion and diversity, it's a tight jobs market. We cannot find the staff that we need. Therefore, we need to be more proactive in reaching out to underrepresented groups. So I was always very cautious of that as a main argument, as a main business case. And that came to the fore. So if the jobs market changes, it's not so much a candidate-driven market. Does that mean that there's no need to focus quite so much on the equality and inclusion agenda? Now, what's happened since then has completely flipped things. So a lot of employers are really trying to do the right thing. There's a pressure to show that you're actually making change happen in terms of creating more diversity in the workplace at all levels. So we've had the whole gender pay debate. That's really driven a lot of change. I expect there to be some changes on looking at pay levels and pay equality for people from different backgrounds. So that will continue to be an agenda. But a lot of this is about making change happen. And again, it will be about how you move from good intentions to genuinely developing a more diverse and equal workforce at all levels. So they're the 7 big workforce challenges that I've picked up over the last 4 weeks, I'd say. So these are very, very timely. Interested to get your questions and feedback on that. And again, making redundancies is one of those topics, and we'll come on to that in a little bit of detail. So hopefully that sets the scene. Again, this is based on the feedback and insight from employers all over the world, but I'm sure a lot of those priorities are priorities for you as business leaders and HR leaders in the UK. Again, if you got any feedback or questions, or want to receive updates on some of that global agenda that I'm working on at the moment, just drop me an email. I'm happy to take that forward afterwards. So Liz, back over to you. Thanks guys for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. That was very comprehensive. If I may, will plunge straight into the questions, because quite a few have come in. The first one: has COVID resulted in more jobs becoming long-term home working?
I think that's one of the questions people are looking at. Again, when you look at how things really change over time, the driver is often from the worker. So what the workers expect, and to be honest, one of the big themes we saw when I was at the REC over the last 2 or 3 years, when you ask recruiters, what questions are they asking before they take on a new job? And the big shift was, one of the biggest questions was, what's this company's approach to flexible working? So I think that was a trend before the crisis. It's no doubt it's accelerated since. But I think there's a risk there, actually. I think there's a perception that that's just going to carry on. And then you start to see some examples where maybe productivity is impacted, maybe the cohesion within the workforce isn't quite as it should be. The danger is, if you don't really think about how you're going to embed it, there starts to be some negative vibes about it, which then think employers say, well, actually, that work from home thing, we need to go away from it and change things. So there's definitely a place. I think there will be opportunities for full-time work from home for those who want, because this comes into the survey that came out today, which I think is fascinating, is about mobility. So
Mhm.
where do people choose to live?
Yes.
And again, there's a lot of talk in the media today about that. And I think there will be opportunities for people to live in a very different place and be working, of an employer, that's based sometimes in a different country or in a different place of work. So it does create a different dynamic. So I think there's absolutely no doubt that it will accelerate what we're already seeing about flexible working coming to the fore, but
Mhm.
how you do it. So I do think it's a good time to reflect, how do we make sure this is sustainable over time going forward? So definitely a big theme, and not just in this country but globally. Absolutely.
Fascinating. Actually, the mobility issue, looking at we're doing a quality and inclusion, as you know, event in
Yep.
September. I was fascinated by what you said about having a proactive reaction to that whole issue, and moving away from the idea of it just being a question of quantifying a business case and
Yeah.
and looking at it from a slightly more sort of cynical perspective. But in terms of social mobility, as
Yes.
inclusion in the workplace,
Yeah.
how do employers guarantee that that's going to happen if you are essentially creating a class of worker who can afford to live somewhere nice, who can work from home, who has that kind of flexibility, who's not somebody, a train driver, the sandwich maker, who's responsible, who's relying on commuters to come into the centre of cities? How do employers tackle something like that?
I think the big question, that there is a risk actually, and when you take a step back and think of our society more generally, and you look at some of the disaffection, and don't forget, we had record employment in this country, but people were still not happy. Why?
Mm.
One, it was perhaps because of lack of progression opportunities, but also people feel dissatisfied when they feel that other people are getting more than they're getting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is a risk in this country and globally that, working in nice white collar jobs, and yes, you can set up, you got your IT, you can work from home, everything's fine. If you're more in the sort of blue collar working, you got to go in and you're still on quite low pay. So this kind of disconnect in society, I think, could be accelerated in some ways. So we do need to be mindful of that. But you make a good point more generally. When we talk about inclusion, we have to think about all strands, and social mobility often gets left behind.
Mm-hmm.
It is about how we reach out to people, and the unifying way forward, I think, on some of this is to have more employers genuinely review how they hire. So what criteria are we using? What process are we using? And there is some good innovation there. And it's not about where you've been to school, what your grades you've got. It's not even about what you've done in the past. But then how do you select that? Because it's easy for me to say that, change the way you select, but how do you do it? You've got a pile of CV. So it does require some thought, and we're starting to see some real innovation there around your initial selection process. Isn't about a CV, it's about answering a bunch of questions.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who are reviewing that questions is not one person, it's a panel. And that panel is a diverse panel, for example. So that's the kind of thought that employers are starting to put into the recruitment process, which I think will help inclusion, diversity, but also help that sort of social mobility and helping people get into jobs which they might feel actually are close to them at the moment. We need to shake things up.
Okay, and that the implication to recruitment as well, presumably, given the point you made at the beginning of your presentation, looking at the way that IT, web-based or web-focused jobs are that there are more of them, people are looking for them. Presumably we'll see a bit of a change in the employment landscape there, but what would be the implications of those jobs to traditional methods of recruitment? Is that going to have an impact there?
Well, I think that the message that's coming through that data I showed from the REC is that in some areas it's still going to be a tight jobs market. So there is still going to be a massive need for IT staff, cybersecurity staff, etc. So that the demand there will continue to be huge.
Mm-hmm.
So that whole focus, I think, on employer brand, on being a great place to work is going to continue. And the one thing, when we did some research at the REC on this, the one word that came out on employer brand, authenticity. It can't just be a marketing exercise. You get seen through authenticity. So are we genuinely a place that puts people at the front and center? And one thing this crisis has done, it's shone the light so people who are genuinely doing it.
Yeah.
That's why we've said all from the very start, actually, how you manage this crisis is going to be key for you. It's going to be how you bounce back, etc. but people are going to ask some hard questions. What did you do during the crisis? How did you respond? How did you look after your staff? Because
Yeah.
if you didn't do that, you can do all the great spin you want, but you will get found out. So authenticity. And I think that will continue. So how you attract staff in high demand areas like cybersecurity, like IT, is going to be a big challenge. Look at your employer brand. Innovate. So one of the campaigns that's running, the Good Recruitment Collective, which the REC run, again, that's a great thing to be involved in. Why? Because it's a peer-to-peer thing. And I think one way that we progress in any walk of life is learning from each other. And I think there's a lot of thought going into that. How do we position ourselves genuinely as a great place to work? And that will continue to be a priority for a lot of employers, especially in those high-end technical roles.
Okay. And that's also, I guess, feeds back into the idea of your reputational risk being under great scrutiny. Those are some interesting areas. Were there any other sensitive areas that employers need to be thinking about, given that they'll all be in the court of social media at one point or another, no doubt, in terms of the way that they've handled themselves during the crisis? Anything that you want to add to that as a heads up?
I think a lot of employers have learned actually and not making snapshot decisions about making cuts. And yes, there's some sectors like hospitality where things are extreme and you've got no real option. I think in other sectors, people realize actually, if we want to bounce back, the one thing we can't do is just go back into our shells and retrench. We can't do that. We have to think about, what does the new normal mean for us as a business? What does it mean for our clients, our consumers? What are the new opportunities out there? And we're going to need good staff to seize those opportunities. So what you don't really want to do is to start making cut and then say, we haven't got the capacity or the skills or the capability to seize these new opportunities. And again, globally, not just in the UK, a lot of employers get that. So they're not being trigger happy, but as we do know, in some sectors there is unfortunately no option. And then we get into another debate how you do it, and a lot of the work I was doing at the REC is about how do you help people who are unfortunately losing their jobs to transition into other sectors, which again is a side debate, but I think there's a lot of thought going into that. How do we help people transition into some of the sectors where there is going to be demand in the future, away from sectors where we know demand is falling?
So reskilling will be
Reskilling is a big agenda, but also and perhaps a good note to conclude on. We've done a lot of this in the last few years in this country about how reskilling people, helping people make transition. What's one of the barriers? One of the barriers is how employers hire. And again, it's why? Because it's the easiest thing to say, have you worked in our sector before? Have you done this job before? Great, come in and have an interview. If you're coming from a different sector, so employers are going to have to be a little bit more flexible and open-minded about how they select people to come into the business. And it might be somebody who's not worked in your sector at all. It might be quite a different role that they've done in the past, but they've had a bit of retraining. They've got the right attitude. They can make an impact. They're energized by the opportunity. Great, let's bring them in. So changes are afoot. We just need to accelerate them going forward.
Interesting and very positive. That's fantastic. Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much for leaving us on slightly more of a high than we started. So thank you for that, and we look forward very much to hearing from you again soon. Take care.
Thank you. Cheers.
And Richard Eichen, I believe, is hopefully going to be with us in a minute or two. Richard, can I ask you to put your camera on as well as your mic? Are you there, Richard?
Yeah, okay.
Wonderful. We can't see your lovely face, so can you check that your camera's on? There we are. Okay. Fantastic. And welcome to you, Richard. It's lovely to see you this morning. Richard, for those of you who don't know him, is an HR and trade unions relations specialist. He has many decades of experience, and he's joining me today to talk more about the redundancy process. Over to you, Richard.
Yeah, hi, Elizabeth. Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me again to this BFI webinar. So I think rather than looking at the mechanics of redundancy, which you're going to do next week on your session on Thursday the 30th, I believe, let's look at the human impact of the process. And I think we've always got to accept that when you mention that word redundancy, there's always going to be some reputational risk, Elizabeth. I think that's just comes with the territory. But I think the vulnerabilities are the same that we've had before COVID and post-COVID. What we've got to learn is, I think we've got to learn that we've got to consult consult and consult. Talk to our trade union reps, talk to our employees. But the ways of reducing the reputational risk for me and mitigation is not difficult. It's just treating employees and treating individuals the way you'd want to be treated yourself. So I think that's kind of my starting point for today's conversation, is treat individuals the way you would want to be treated yourself.
Mm.
Okay, so I think kind of moving on, you know, most trade unions and employees would accept that it's a business decision when you have to lose people. It's for a business reason. It's not personal. It's because you've got to reduce your workforce because of either a change of working or operating, or just frankly saving money. But what organisations do need to do, and I can't overemphasise it enough, is clearly explain the reasons why they've got to do what they've got to do. You know, it's a business decision, and it must be only be taken at the very, very last resort. And I think if you explain to people why, they will appreciate that. So you've got to discuss with people and trade unions as part of the consultation process all the options that you considered, that only leaves that final option of redundancy. So do explore all the options and seek their views and the trade unions on ways of making the options you've thought about work, and indeed ask them to put forward any options as well.
And can I just ask you, because I know when we've talked previously in events that looked very specifically at working with trade unions, there has been a considerable drop in membership numbers recently, and at the same time there's been a rise in trade unions, sort of non-traditional trade unions. Where do you see the future going after COVID? Once we're kind of through all of this, do you think there will still be a role for trade unions? Do you think it'll be a stronger? What will it look like, do you think?
Absolutely, yes. There is a role for trade unions, but I think the way I think we should be looking at it is the actual body, whether it's a trade union or not, may change. It may be a company forum, or it may be a council, whatever that body is that represents employees. That may change its name, but the ultimate objective is they're representing employees. So whatever we call it, let's not get sidelined by what we call it. It is still a body of employees representing employees. And I think for me the key is, again, and I've got to go back to it, consult, consult, consult. Talk open and honestly with whatever group staff representative that is. But you're right, trade unions traditionally have lost their position on in the employment market, and it's the challenge for trade unions now is to make themselves attractive, particularly to the younger end of the employment market.
How are they going to do that, do you think, given that they're traditionally seen as something very male dominated, you know, very keen to strike? What would be an attractive positioning for them in 2020 post-COVID?
Yeah, I think they've got to make themselves relevant to the employees and members that they are representing, and obviously underpin and remind people the benefits of having a single point of contact for employers and employees as well. And I think many of the new trade unions as well coming online will obviously you know, be perhaps playing that better than the more traditional trade unions, like one of our colleagues has commented here, the IWGB, who organising the gig economy. And that's a great comment that David has made there, one of our viewers this morning. The new independent unions are perhaps managing the marketing aspect better than the more traditional trade unions that we're used to.
They're embracing a lot of the new technology, aren't they? I remember reading something about some trade unions in one of the Nordic countries who were purely app-based. Am I being very old-fashioned here? Is that how everybody's doing it these days? But looking to attract very different sort of memberships, perhaps you know, amongst undocumented workers or migrant workers as well, so that it is a truly inclusive approach to representing a workforce.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's all about using whatever portal that may be that
Mm.
your membership find most comfortable. If you want, if you know, if it's through an app, if it's through Facebook, if it's through WhatsApp, whatever technology that you believe your membership would most easily use. And that's the challenge for traditional trade unions, is to find those new ways in of promoting their benefits of being in that union. And I think it's right that they adjust that approach. So if they're going to be less bureaucratic, if that suits their membership, that's what they should be. And you've basically got to change your mould to suit your membership.
Yeah.
But also the function is still the same. You still need to consult with them and talk to them.
Okay, and then moving on a little bit to you know, to the very, very difficult position that an awful lot of employers are finding themselves in now, where they are having to make redundancies and let people go. Would you have anything to say on that to our audience this morning?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's going back to the pure basics of where we are, and that is you've got to do everything you can, absolutely everything you can, to avoid the redundancy. And one of the flip sides of that is, of course, remember, if you lose people, you lose the skills and experience that you have invested in as an organisation. By letting staff go, you're losing the skills that you've invested in and the knowledge if you let people go. But only then, if in that really regrettable situation you have to reduce the workforce or move the process from one part of the country to the other, or even indeed another country, making a decision is a very last resort. And I think that's what you've got to get over to employees and trade unions when you consult. And that is that you're doing this the very, very last option.
Yeah.
Because there's no winners. Well, there's no. I don't think the organisation wins from losing employees, because you're losing the skills and experience that you might need in the future. And inevitably, when there is an upturn, you've got to go back to readdressing your recruitment process again. Many organisations I've worked for have gone through periods of ups and downs. You shed your workforce, which is a knee-jerk reaction, and then in 10 years' time, you need new apprentices, you need new employees, and you've lost all those retraining skills that you need. And you have to go back out and recreate your apprenticeship programs, which is a real shame, because you've lost even the ability of how you remember you train an apprentice. And I've seen that so many times.
And we have a comment as well, talking about sort of following on from your comment about making consulting your key approach, that the problem seems to be that employers and trade unions are not tackling the issue of redundancy or alternative solutions earlier enough. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, and thank you to Charles for bringing that into the debate. You know, one of the principles is there's no precise time to start consultation on redundancy. You've got to do it at the earliest opportunity. So I think for me, as soon as it begins to come into an organisation's mind, that's the point at which you go to your full-time official and you say, hey, look, just to give you the heads up, you know, we're in a mature relationship. Things aren't looking good with regards to this and that. And I will want to start working with you to make sure that we avoid any redundancies, or if we make redundancies. What can we do before that? How can we preempt it? How can we look at new ways of working? Let's start the conversation now. And there you've got your evidence, nice early doors. You start a consultation. It may be an informal meeting with your full-time officer. It may be a no firm ideas. And indeed, that's the way it should be, because if you start talking early, you can both talk about constructive ways of avoiding those redundancies.
Fantastic.
Because it is the very, very last resort.
Okay. And then briefly, so I'm going to bring Penny in a moment. In terms of alternatives to redundancies, in your experience, what are the things that might work?
So I think we need to be looking at alternative ways of working. We need to be looking at potentially looking at what is valuable, what do we need to do, what don't we need to do, how can we retrain people to perhaps go to other parts of the organisation. I mean, I made a large substantial office in the northeast. I made all the employees redundant. We stupid out part of that process to Mumbai. It was the backroom services it was, and actually after we'd looked at how we could avoid doing that, at the end of the day, if your only option is redundancy, well, then it's all about treating people with humanity and respect and being reasonable and deal with people in a caring manner, because at the end of the day, you know, ultimately you will be seen as a bad person, because you're not just affecting the individual employee, you're impacting on their family, you're impacting on mothers, daughters, sisters, children. And for me, it's not all about monetary compensation, it's about giving people as much notice as possible and think outside the box. And you know, if you can, you know, try and improve your normal redundancy scheme, put some additional weeks onto the scheme, so make it just be as fair and reasonable as you can. Because people will ultimately feel you are destroying their lives. And so for me, it's about providing people with options, because if you've got options, you can then at least start to plan your life in the next stage of your career.
Give options.
So if you can, you know, increase your normal redundancy scheme. Think about providing people training grants to go on to a new career. See whether you can, say, if people that have been affected by redundancy have got company cars, can they purchase company cars at discounted rates? Can they purchase additional pension at discounted rates? Actively seek anniversary dates. Many redundancy schemes obviously are based on age and length of service. So if people have got specific anniversary dates, look and see and work with people if they can leave at financially advantageous times. And if you can, plan, and plan.
Fabulous. Thank you so much.
Okay, that's great. So I think it's things like that.
There. Thank you very much indeed. And we do have a question which looks at redundancies' negative impact on mental health, which is and asking, is there a role for counselling in the redundancy process, which is where Penny Aspinall now comes in. Penny, can I ask you to put your camera and mic on? Richard, thank you so much for your contribution. And
you're very welcome. Thank you.
Lovely to see you. Penny, the role of counselling in the redundancy process. I'm going to, can you show your screen for us now? I'm going to hand over to you and then we will be back with questions. How are you doing?
Hang on a sec. I'm not sure why it's not showing. Here we go.
You're working beautifully.
Just get it onto the slide show.
Fantastic.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks everybody. It's quite nice being last because it's really interesting listening to what everyone else is saying, and hopefully everything will all come together because we're all talking very much in the same kind of way, in the same language. So I'm going to be talking about how we're going to be thinking about mental health as we move into the next phase of this pandemic. Just a very quick word about Charlie Waller. It is a charity that started up 22 years ago in memory of a young man called Charlie who very tragically lost his fight against depression and took his own life. He was only 28 and he seemed to have everything to live for. And all his friends and family were incredibly shocked because they'd no idea how much he'd been struggling. So the family set up the trust with the vision that people could understand and talk openly about depression, and where young people, most of the work we do is with young people, know how to maintain well-being and where the most appropriate treatment is available to everyone who needs it. So moving on to COVID and the impact on people's mental health, and I think this will all be very familiar to everybody by now because there's been a lot of talk about the impact of this whole crisis on people's mental health across the world, not just in this country. And obviously anxiety, worry, stress from all the uncertainty and all the unknowns have been very prevalent. depression, grief, lots of loss. We've had a very high death rate in the UK, and the loss of loved ones has been exacerbated by not being able to see them, not being able to say goodbye properly, not being able to be together to grieve, and the impact on funerals. Then we've had isolation and loneliness, especially amongst the 19 to 30-year-old group. They've been particularly badly affected. And then the impact on relationships. Now, it's a complex picture, because actually, so for example, we take example the impact on relationships. For as many people have had a negative impact, there've also been positive impacts. So there's a lot of either or. It's not all bad. But I think in terms of impact on relationships, which we've mentioned briefly earlier about in the workplace, how about the person who's carried the can and kept on working, and their feelings about the person who's been on furlough, and vice versa. So thinking about impact on relationships in the workplace is quite an interesting thought. So you all know, and we've talked about, it's a good thing to do reputationally, as well as ethically, as well as practically. If your staff have good mental well-being, then everybody is more operationally resilient and more productive, so it's good for business. And this whole time has given us a real opportunity to refocus on mental health, and also to bring employees along with you on the journey. Lots of people have put in place some really interesting and imaginative initiatives helping support their employees who are, say, working from home, or maybe even those on furlough. But it's complex and it's confusing. There's nothing about this whole situation that's easy or simple, and that includes helping your employees' mental health and well-being. So who are we looking at? Lots of people have carried on working all the way throughout, including all those unsung heroes, the people, for example, in those meat processing factories, the people in the boohoo, for example. So lots of people have carried on working throughout it. Then there are the people who are working from home, who are possibly continuing to work from home, maybe all the time, maybe having a sort of hybrid of working from home some of the time and all of the time, and managing that will be something that you'll be needing to think about. But perhaps we're thinking mostly about the people who've been on furlough and returning to work from the 1st of August. That could be part-time, it could be full-time. How we manage the transition from being on furlough to being back to work, how that affects people's confidence, people's anxiety about their safety, and so on. And then the people who we've mentioned a lot already, those who have no job to return to. They've been on furlough and they're now facing redundancy. What are you going to do to protect their mental health and well-being? And then we've got the shielded people who are expected to return to work on the 1st of August, and they will be experiencing very real fear and anxiety about going out there into the world, perhaps getting to work, public transport. And their fears are not irrational, their fears are perfectly rational, because if they catch the virus, it could be a death sentence. So very, very heightened fear and anxiety around. But one size does not fit all, and there are so many variables in this. So where on earth do you begin? I wish there were some easy answers. There aren't. But I do think it's helpful to think about the stages of change and loss, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with when you're looking at organisational change. And these are based on the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross process or of the stages of grief. Her work dealing with talking to people facing terminal illness or losing loved ones. And so let's just quickly look at it in terms of how we've managed actually being through the whole pandemic. We start off with sort of shock and denial and uncertainty. Is this happening? What's going to be happening? And then we move into, we've all got to go into lockdown, and that's brought about a lot of feelings: anger, fear, resistance, sadness, anxiety, depression, sometimes yo-yoing from one to the other. People have spoken very much about being on a roller coaster of emotions. And then we all kind of get used to it. I can't believe that Elizabeth said the 16th one. So we're all getting used to it, especially when some of the lockdown measures were slightly loosened, and we start to accept it and integrate it into our lives. We get used to being on furlough, we get used to working from home, we get used to moving aside to give people 2 meters in the street, and we come to our new lockdown normal. And now it's all changing. So this change cycle's got to be reversed. And we're being told to eat out to help out. We're having to get out there, get the economy going, and many people are going to be going back to work, or have already started going back to work. But we think, is it safe? And I was putting mind of the glass floor in Blackpool Tower. And your rational mind knows that it's safe. But that's completely the rational mind gets completely overtaken by your instinctive feeling of, whoa, that's not safe, I'm not going there. And I think there's going to be a lot of work done convincing people that it is safe, but then again, lots of mixed messages, it's not really that safe. So on the one hand, we're being told by the Prime Minister that he hopes things will be back to normal by Christmas, but on the other hand, we're being told there may be an even bigger wave coming in the autumn, and that the virus might be around for the next 10 years. So again, how do you manage to get people's confidence back up, but not so much they get complacent and we get a new wave? So they're very difficult things to manage in terms of people's fear, anxiety, and perhaps even a sense of sort of hopelessness and despair in the face of all that. So back to mental health. Okay, stating the obvious, everyone is different, which is why, as I said, the one size fits all doesn't work. And everyone's situation is different. And one thing about this pandemic, it's really highlighted huge social inequalities and differences between the haves and the have-nots. So some people, it's perhaps just been a bit difficult, perhaps even a minor inconvenience, and other people, it's been a devastating situation for them both practically, financially, and with all the impact on their mental health and being that goes along with that. So bringing people back to work is going to be challenging. So what do you need to do when you're thinking about your risk assessments? Obviously, you'll be looking at people's personal safety. And I think if people feel that you're really looking after their safety, that'll go a long way to helping them feeling psychologically more secure about coming back to work. But there's also about really focusing on what are you doing to protect people's mental health and well-being when you're bringing them back to work, and perhaps thinking about individual risk assessments as well as risk assessments for the whole team or the whole company, because as I said before, everyone is different and everyone's situation is different. So you might be wanting to give particular concern to those with pre-existing mental health conditions. For them, it may be positive returning to work, but it may well be presenting very real challenges, especially taking the plunge and building up the confidence to get back into the workplace. So, you know, all your skills there in helping them. And then those who have been shielding, who'll be very rightly very anxious and nervous. And also really considering those who are from group who are vulnerable due to their race or ethnicity. I was speaking to a colleague from the Bangladeshi community, and she was talking very much about the very, very real fears that people from her community are having about getting out there and possibly contracting the virus, for whom it could well be a death sentence, or they could pass it on to vulnerable people. So really thinking about talking things through with those groups who may have very, very, very real difficult concerns and a lot of fear around. And also perhaps people with children, especially during the holidays, but also people who've been managing perhaps their teenagers' impact on their teenagers' mental health and the pressure that might put on them and their stress levels. So back to the change cycle, and I think this can really help, giving you a sort of model that might actually be helpful, both in reintegrating people back into the workplace and also helping people manage if they're being made redundant, and just understanding the kind of phases that people will be going through, that they do move through these stages, although it might not be completely linear. It's often not totally linear, but just understanding the kind of the shock, the denial, and then the anger, and then eventually the acceptance and the integration into people's lives, and then we will get back to the new normal and things will settle down again. So I do think it's quite helpful to bear this in mind. And really importantly, and I think this is the most important thing of all, to give the proper support and training for your line managers and your HR staff. Your line managers are going to be there at the front line and managing and absorbing all these emotions and putting in place the initiatives and dealing with individuals' mental health difficulties and their stress, their anxiety, their fear. And that is difficult. That's really hard, especially if you're dealing with your own anxieties and difficulties and struggling with your own mental health issues at the same time. And what are you doing to support those HR staff who may be the ones who are going to be having to make people redundant? That is a really horrible job. So you really, really need to pay attention to protecting and supporting the people who are at the front line of managing these kind of processes, because they are difficult. They may be realistic, tough business decisions to make, but they're difficult, and they're difficult for the people who have to give the bad news. So do attend to those staff members. At the Charlie Waller Trust, we're putting all our training online, so if you're interested in that, and we've also got a whole load of resources you can download, including a new wellbeing action plan for life after lockdown, so that covers maybe people who haven't got jobs to return to as well. And then finally, don't forget your own mental health. How is this situation affecting you personally, professionally? Tough decisions to make, it's not easy. And having these conversations at senior leadership levels will really help you to put in place meaningful and authentic measures to support your staff. Tom talked about authenticity earlier, and that is so important. And by putting yourself in that place, you will then be much more empathic, much more compassionate, and much more authentic in what you do. Thank you for listening. And I know it's a bit cheeky, but we are a charity. We do depend on your donations to keep going. So if you'd like to give us anything, that would be fab.
Excellent, and I can add my request to you for that too. Thank you very much indeed, Penny. I'm going to just appear by magic here, and one of our in fact, somebody who's watched us from the very beginning says thank you for mentioning how hard this can be on us, Penny. I feel seen, so thank you for that. And Bramwell, we're delighted that Penny was helpful for you this morning. Couple of points to go back on. Are there figures yet on the way that the mental health diagnoses are happening post-COVID, given that most people have yet to see a GP or haven't seen a GP for 5 months? Are there dangers, do you think, of self-diagnosis in this case? If somebody might be understandably quite anxious about going back to work, perhaps that might blow up in their own heads as something much bigger that then, you know, becomes almost phobic when actually it wasn't that to start with. Is that a possibility?
Yeah. I think. Well, I think it probably is. I think it's interesting looking at the figures, because it does seem that anxiety, the mental health issues did settle down. I was looking at sort of a whole range of figures, did settle down. And now anxiety is ratcheting up again. Now we're going out of lockdown. But actually, it's very tempting to look at all the bad news stories. But there have been some positive effects from being at home, being with your children, just having a bit of downtime, some positive effects for people's finances as well. But I think it really does, this situation has really highlighted the huge social divides. And I think there are some people for whom it's been fine and other people for whom it hasn't been. I think it's interesting to look at the effect on people who suffer from OCD of this. The impact of this, because on the one hand you're being told keep washing your hands, for example, and I think that can really trigger people's obsessive compulsive disorders. So I think people perhaps who've been prone towards depression, prone towards anxiety, this will exaggerate it. But yeah, you're right, people might self-diagnose, but I think once people start to feel confident and comfortable again, hopefully that will settle. But it's hard to tell because it's all too early for us, really.
Of course.
Really real data about the full impact.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And we've touched in this webinar and several of the events that we've been doing online during COVID about the idea of workplace relations once most workforces are actually back in the workplace. You talked about it earlier, where you have people who've been on furlough and colleagues who were working throughout those, can you believe it, 16 weeks. And there will be a lot of work for organisations to do in terms of healing those relationships and divides. And then obviously, you know, pre that we had Brexit. During COVID, we've had the Black Lives Matter protests, and that has caused an awful lot of febrile tension in many cases. One of the questions that I have for you is how, we don't have that many paid counsellors in HR. Obviously, there are occupational health functions which are there to provide support to employees, but on this unprecedented scale, do you think that HR as a function is qualified to look at those things? Are they able to provide group counselling or one-to-one counselling? If an HR manager asked you, how do I help? What do I do to support my colleagues coming back into work? What would be your sort of top 2 tips for how to do that? Is it something?
Well, first of all, if they've got an EAP, yeah, I mean, lots of organisations have EAPs, and then so hopefully you could refer people who are in extreme need.
If like most of them, they're going to be incredibly stretched. Are there basic things that HR can look out for from a layman's perspective when they have their colleagues coming back in?
I think the most helpful thing that anybody can do is the one that it sounds easy but it's hard, is just to listen and help people feel heard. Thinking about what Branwen says, I feel seen, feeling heard and allowing people to talk things through, I think is the most important thing that you can do. And it's easier said than done because people often want to rush in with solutions. So just allowing people to feel heard is really, really important. And there's a lot to talk about the sort of idea of compassionate leadership, which is compassion plus action as well. So if anything needs to be done, either try and do it, or if it can't be done, perhaps explaining why. A lot of the things that Tom said earlier. Facilitating maybe team meetings where people can feel safe to talk about what they feel. And to air that, I think that's probably quite important as well. But to denying things are happening and sweeping it under the carpet is really not helpful. And just to be very, very aware of where your limitations are. And if people can't refer on to something like an EAP, at least perhaps you can suggest people see their GP or look at what mental health services are available in their area. Or helplines, and not to try to wade in and do it themselves, because you can then end up getting into quite deep water.
Indeed. That, I'm afraid, is all we have time for today. That has been it's been a whistle stop, but it's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Penny. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Tom. Delightful to work with you all, as it always is. We will be back on the 6th of August looking at the glamorous subject area of data protection and GDPR issues that COVID has thrown up. We are, as I said, running a redundancy and restructuring conference next Thursday afternoon, Thursday the 23rd of July, featuring quite an extraordinary lineup of experts there. Do consider making a donation to the Charlie Waller Memorial Trust. They do extraordinary work in organisations. And in the meantime, I wish you all a safe and peaceful couple of weeks, and we will be back in a fortnight. Thank you for watching.